Hey everybody, and welcome back to Video Mess. So today we're going to get a fun and exciting episode for you guys this Friday because we're going to be talking about what happened with the 3DO M2 and Sega deal. Because as I've alluded to in the past but never fully told this story, Sega was at the 11th hour as far as buying 3DO M2 technology and releasing it as the successor console to the Saturn. But the deal broke down in basically the last meeting, and I'm here to tell you how that happened. And I have interviewed people that were in the room, engineers that worked on the M2 project, so I do have a lot of evidence to back this up. But basically, Sega was going to be buying the 3DO M2 technology and releasing it in both arcades and as a home console because 3DO Company wanted to get out of the console business and wanted to basically sell off the rights to M2, which they ended up doing to Matsushita and Panasonic once they couldn't figure out how to produce the console themselves. And that has always been one of my biggest regrets in gaming, that the 3DO M2 console never actually saw store shelves, but I'm here to tell you just how close it actually got to doing it and what small problem ended up making Sega walk away from the table. That small problem is in the middle. It is the Bulldog ASIC. This is basically, for lack of a better term, the GPU of the 3DO M2. It does a lot more things than that, but this is handling all the graphics. And the problem isn't even in the Bulldog ASIC. It's in a manufacturing issue that IBM caused when they were demoing the hardware to Sega in the final hours, because normally this is what the 3DO M2 would have looked like. This is Total Vice here, an absolutely awesome game that I may cover again on the channel in the future. This was Konami making day one 3DO M2 titles, and this is what you would have expected to see had the 3DO M2 come to market. Just remember, this would have been in like late 96, early 97, beating the Dreamcast by almost 18 to 24 months. And Sega was basically in the press everywhere as far as purchasing M2 and 3DO were concerned. Pretty much every magazine was running articles on this. Japanese newspapers were reporting it as well, and even Trip Hawkins, the founder and CEO of the 3DO company, in interviews has talked about how close he was to a partnership with Sega. At one point in time, he even almost had Philips, the producer of the CDI, on board. Basically, M2 was being shopped around to anyone who would show interest in it because the 3DO company was running out of money and they needed to sell off the rights to this technology as far as M2 was concerned. And Trip's first thought was basically to get a coalition of other console makers to take on Sony and the PlayStation, but that fell through, and the deal was still on the table potentially for Sega to come and buy M2, release it as a console. Somewhere between $100 to $250 million is what was discussed. But the issue again was with the last demo that the 3DO company showed to Sega. Sega was coming in expecting to see near finalized hardware, running different diverse demos, some of which I will show you in this video. And as far as the actual Bulldog ASIC was concerned, it was produced in IBM fabs. IBM supplied the PowerPC 602, IBM supplied all of the manufactured chips for the 3DO M2. The 3DO company just designed them, and you'll see here if we take a look at the arcade board. Again, Sega wanted something that would be both a home console as well as an arcade board, exactly like you would see with Dreamcast and Naomi. So this was a very appealing thing to Sega because the 3DO company was also basically developing these top boards with Matsushita to try to basically be able to make this an arcade board at the same time. And we need to talk a little bit more about the 3DO M2 architecture to understand what goes wrong in that final demo, because this is a unified RAM structure. That means that all 8 megabytes of RAM are available to whatever chip wants to use them. If in your program you want to apply more RAM for the graphic, or you want to do a certain graphical effect, you can do that. There is no program RAM, there is no video RAM, it is just RAM, and you allocate that pool however you see fit. And that was going to be the problem in the final test, because if we take a look at this diagram here, you're going to see the PowerPC 602s have direct access to that shared RAM at 8 megabytes, and the Bulldog ASIC also has paths to that RAM. So you have all of the chips on board being able to basically communicate with the memory so that it can read and write to any memory address it needs and sees fit. The unfortunate part is that's not how the test worked, but I'm going to get that in just a minute because I want to explain the technology fully, as well as go over some other quotes from Tom Kalinske of Sega of America as to just how closely this actually got. But you'll see here with the PowerPCs on the right, the Bulldog in the center, and the RAM to the left, these are all within the same bus, and you need to be able to communicate with everything effectively. So when Sega came in to try to see a demo, something like this running on real 3DO M2 hardware that I captured, that's what they were expecting. And Tom Kalinske said in an interview that they were very close to using the M2 technology technology and that they had had meetings in Japan where this was discussed. So we have Sega on record, ex-employees of Sega, and obviously Tom Kalinske wasn't just the janitor, he was very high up in the company, stating as such that the M2 was almost a done deal. And you'll see here that again, Sega was considering using the M2 technology as the basis for their next generation hardware, because you'll see here in this quote from Tom Kalinske, they said that a few Sega M2 units did exist back in the day. Now those would have been prototype units, and that would have been on the single PowerPC chipset, because the 3DO M2 did add a second PowerPC within the process of developing the hardware, because they actually wanted to amp up the overall power of the 3DO M2. And the entire reason that the 3DO M2 never appears on the market from Sega is down to one small factor that changes the course of gaming history. Basically, IBM fucked up. When the boards came in from IBM Fabrication Labs to 3DO engineers, they started to test them, and they realized there was a huge fundamental flaw that they didn't have time to fix. IBM missed an entire layer in the PCB, so there were missed connections as far as the chips and how they could communicate with themselves. What that meant was Bulldog had absolutely no access to the RAM on board, so now your 3D chip, the heart of the 3DO M2, cannot access any of the 8 megabytes of pooled RAM. So you have the PowerPC, and that can talk to the CE32 chip, and you have the processor which can talk to the RAM, but the Bulldog right in the middle can only communicate with the CPU. It has no direct RAM access whatsoever because that layer was missed, and Bulldog now has no clue that there's any RAM on board. You'll see all the traces coming out here. If you miss a layer in the silicon, all of those interconnects are going to be completely broken. Maybe it might be possible to hand wire it from the bottom, but who knows? So these are the demos that Sega would have expected to see. 3D models running at a nice frame rate, fully textured, showing off the overall power of the 3DO M2. This is running at about 30 frames per second, and some of the demos do run at 60. What the executives from Sega of Japan and Sega of America ended up seeing were untextured models that drew at 1 to 2 frames per second. That is because Bulldog could not access any RAM whatsoever. Everything had to be done on the tiny amount of cache sitting within that chip. This is even a generous example of what that would have seemed like, and there would have been no textures whatsoever. Compare that to something like Evil Knight running on the arcade board like 18 months later, and you can totally understand why Sega, looking to spend between $100 to $250 million on a platform, would not be excited to see that final test running at 1 to 2 frames per second with absolutely no texture work whatsoever. And honestly, would you want to spend upwards of $200 million if that was one of the final tests you saw? So as opposed to playing something like Battle Trist on a Sega console running at 60 frames per second with a smooth overall motion, tons of polygons for the time and error, and full texture mapping, they saw an untexture map slideshow. This is what the world could have been like had IBM not missed that layer in the fabrication. You could have been putting something like Shenmue into a 3DO M2 powered Sega console and playing it that way instead. And this door is a little bit broken, I need to fix that for sure. And it wasn't just Sega in on this as well, because obviously Sega had partners in the arcade sphere. Somebody like Capcom developing Power Stone went to the Sega Naomi to be able to run that game, but even Power Stone was originally in development for the 3DO M2, and I am highly suspicious that Sega had something to do with that, because Capcom was definitely friendly with Sega, so it makes perfect sense it would have started there, and when Sega abandoned the M2, I'm assuming so did Capcom. So this one little chip here, tons of people worked on its development. This had the potential to do a lot of great things in 1996 and 1997, and while it did get used in the Panasonic FC21 and FC35 as an internet appliance and as a coffee maker and ATM of all things, and obviously it got used in the arcade boards, it never got its chance to shine in the home console market where it was supposed to, and that is all down to the fact that in one of the final tests with Sega, these 8 RAM chips right here were invisible to the actual Bulldog ASIC because IBM made a mistake, and they made it so late in the game that they could not spin up another run before the executives from Sega showed up. So that probably tells you 2 things. 1, don't trust IBM, and 2, if you're demoing hardware, do not have it show up the day before the test. Always give yourself some breathing room. But that is how close we got to the 3DO M2 seeing retail shelves with a Sega logo on it. If IBM didn't miss that one layer, it is very possible Sega would have gone through with the deal, and we might be playing the M3 or M4 these days. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below and tell me what you think of all this, because I'm sure for some people it's going to be new information. But I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.